Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this session of the New England Biography series sponsored by the Massachusetts Historical Society. My name is Kennesorn Wong-Sri Chanlai. I'm the Director of Research here at the MHS. And before we begin, let me take a moment to thank the steering committee members for this seminar series. They always bring wonderful presenters who encourage us to think critically about the craft of history and biography to our building here at 1154 Boylston Street. Megan Marshall of Emerson College, Julie Dobrow of Tufts University, Natalie Dykstra of Hope College, thank you very much for all you do for this series and for the MHS. For attendees new to the MHS, we are the first historical society in the nation. The clocks run slightly slow. We are home to 14 million manuscript pages and counting. We grow by 150 linear feet every year, so we're still a growing institution. Among these papers and manuscripts, you will find the papers of 3 generations of the Adams family, as well as Thomas Jefferson's personal papers. But we also have the papers of abolitionists and merchants and historians and civil rights champions and scientific pioneers and political leaders and teachers and people from all walks of life. So invite you to visit our website and explore our holdings. And while you are there, we also encourage you to take a look at our programs. We, in the research department, run 7 series over the course of the academic year. So between September and May, there's usually something for everyone. We have programs about African American history, digital history, environmental history, early American history, and of course, biography as well. So please visit us, and also visit us starting next Friday, the 28th of March, when the upstairs will be open, and we will have our exhibit on the 250th anniversary of the battles of Lexington and Concord, Bunker Hill, and the start of the American Revolution. Today's program will proceed as follows. I shall introduce our 2 special guests this evening. After that, Professor Marshall will speak for a short period from this podium. She will then be joined on stage by Professor John Stauffer, who is going to talk to her for a little bit, and then we'll go to questions from the audience. We'll have about 15 to 20 minutes for that at the end. If you are in the room, simply raise your hand, and I'll come over with a microphone, and you can ask your question there. If you are online, you're joining us online, type your question into the chat, and one of our staff members will read them on your behalf. We're going to wrap up at 6:15 p.m. here. And then we're going to go to a book signing if any of you are interested in purchasing Afterlives. Megan will be happy to sign them in the room where we had the reception prior to this program. All right. Megan Marshall is the Charles Wesley Emerson College professor at Emerson College, as well as a past president of the Society of American Historians. Her biographies of Margaret Fuller, Elizabeth Bishop, and the Peabody Sisters have won numerous awards, including the Pulitzer Prize, the Francis Parkman Prize, the Mark Linton History Prize, and the Massachusetts Book Award for Nonfiction. Her book on the Peabody Sisters was aided by the collections at the Massachusetts Historical Society from this very room, which is usually a reading room when we don't have the stage out. Professor Marshall is the recipient of the 2022 Bio Award given annually by the Biographers International Organization to a distinguished colleague who has made major contributions to the advancement of the art and the craft of biography. Professor Marshall will be joined in conversation by John Stauffer, who is a professor of English and African American Studies at Harvard University. Professor Stauffer is the author or editor of 20 books, including Giants, The Parallel Lives of Frederick Douglass and Abraham Lincoln, The Black Hearts of Men, which co-won the Frederick Douglass Book Prize, and Picturing Frederick Douglass, which was a finalist for the Lincoln Prize. His essays and reviews have appeared in Time, Wall Street, the New York Times, the Washington Post, as well as many scholarly journals. So, for now, let me bring up our guest of honor tonight, and someone I'm honored to call my friend, Professor Megan Marshall.
Well, thank you so much, Kid, as we often call Kennesorn. And I want to thank Cassie Cloutier, who's manning the computer and tech, and a wonderful assistant. I know a number of friends called me and said, I have the flu, or this or that, or the other thing, and they're watching online. I just want you to know that Cassie will get your questions. That's going to happen. I also want to acknowledge, along with Natalie Dykstra and Julie Dobro, who are my co-steering committee members for the New England Biography series. I want to acknowledge Susan Ware, who's the founder of this series. It was her bright idea, I don't know, maybe as long as 15 years ago, that we should start this, and she's here tonight. Thanks, John, also for pitching questions. And I also really just want to give my thanks to the Mass Historical Society, which is where I learned how to be a biographer, with help from staff members like Conrad Wright, who's here, Ann Bentley, Brenda Lawson, and Mary Kelly, who was not a staff member but was a wonderful historian who happened to be doing her research at the same time and welcomed me as a colleague. And especially I want to thank Peter Drummey. We were sort of young here together. We have grown up since then, but he has put together a fabulous exhibit of items related to a couple of the essays in this book. And if you didn't get a chance to look at it during the reception, please look at it afterwards. So thank you, Peter. This book is called Afterlives for a number of reasons. The most obvious of them, and it's the reason that Afterlives is spelled, is two words rather than one word, as we're more used to having it. This is a book that I began working on, not realizing really it would become a book, after having written 3 major biographies in 30 years' time. It was 2017 when my biography of Elizabeth Bishop was published. I had kind of exhausted my capability to write under deadline pressure. After all that time, I didn't really want to sign up for a next big book at that point. And it was also a time like now, when we had a new presidential administration. Catastrophe was in the air. Did anything matter that I had ever done before or might ever do? I was having trouble figuring out what my writing life might be going forward. And I was really kind of stalled for a while. But then as 2018 rolled around, I remembered that I had a stash of papers that were my grandparents when they were in Paris during World War I. 2018 was the centennial of the armistice, and I just thought, let me look at these letters and see what I might be able to make of them. It was very comforting that I had saved these, that they had saved them, and that I had this whole record of what I thought might actually reveal that my grandfather, who I had known as someone who suffered from depression, I thought I was going to find that he had suffered shell shock or something like that. But instead, this opened me to a world of when he was young, my grandmother was young, they were in their 20s, they were newly married. He managed to get his young wife to come with him to Paris, even though it was wartime. They lived together and had the first years of a happy marriage there. And he was the director of photography and film for the press corps there. And this whole story, a kind of a love story, came out of that, and also a sense of what it was like to live with disaster striking all about you. There they were in Paris with bombs falling. I finished that piece, and what was I to do next? Another anniversary was coming up, a very different one for me. It was in 2020 was going to be the 50th anniversary of the death of my high school classmate, Jonathan Jackson, at age 17, in a widely publicized incident that you'll recognize when I read a bit about this. I wanted Jonathan, who was kind of disappeared from this story. We know about Angela Davis. We know about his older brother, George Jackson, who wrote letters from prison, Soledad brother. But Jonathan has been portrayed as the lone gunman who entered this, you'll hear about it. He was just 17, and I wanted him to be remembered, and I wanted to kind of revisit this period of late 60s, early 70s, in Pasadena and Altadena, where I had grown up. So I'm going to read a little bit from the beginning of this essay, "Free for a While," which is a phrase that after Jonathan's death, his brother George applied to this action of his, which still has haunted me, haunted everyone who knew Jonathan, trying to make sense of it. Free for a while. My first year of school was interrupted in early spring 1960 when my family moved from a small ranch house in Los Altos, then a bedroom suburb of San Francisco surrounded by mustard fields and rolling hills dotted with California live oaks, to a two-story colonial in Pasadena, a city of more than 100,000, about 300 miles to the south. Despite the larger house, this was no step up. My dad had lost his job as a city planner for Santa Clara County after drinking too much at an office party, a blunder he would repeat to similar effect in future years, and we were retreating to the city of his youth. A childhood friend had found him a job in Los Angeles, a half-hour drive down the Pasadena freeway, the oldest freeway in the country, which started or ended at our new hometown. I was sad to leave my kindergarten friends behind in Los Altos and sensitive to the cloud of shame that trailed us. You can see all that in my face in a photograph taken at the Pasadena Central Library the summer after our move. The book includes that photograph, so you'll be able to see that. But I'm going to describe it here. My father's mother, nearing retirement in her job as children's librarian, was known for her weekly vacation story hour, and a photographer from a local newspaper had come to document her work. The picture is a snapshot of the multiracial community Pasadena was and still is, though the photo is misleading about the extent of racial mixing in the city, both then and now. The story group had moved outside to the building's hacienda-style courtyard after listening to my grandmother's program of tales gleaned from the folk traditions of 4 continents, chosen to appeal to an audience of children who could trace their ancestries back at varying distances to Africa, Mexico, Japan, China, and Europe. I'm standing in the center of the back row wearing a striped t-shirt. Also standing, second from the left, is Denise Hulamard, the beaming 7-year-old who would grow up to become one of our high school's first Black homecoming queens during our senior year. I recognized Denise when I came across the photograph recently and wondered if she'd ever brought Jonathan Jackson, her across-the-street playmate and fellow student at St. Andrew Catholic School, to story hour. I didn't know him then. That would come later, when both Denise and Jonathan shifted into public high school. But I calculated that 1960, the year of the story hour photograph, also marked the last time Jonathan had seen his older brother, George, outside prison or a courtroom. Jailed at 18 with a sentence of 1 year to life after accepting a plea deal over a $70 gas station robbery, George Jackson began reading Marx, Lenin, Trotsky, and Mao as 1 year stretched to 4 and then 10. He joined other Black guerrillas, guerrillas as in soldiers, on the inside, working to transform the Black criminal mentality into a Black revolutionary mentality, George would write in the introduction to Soledad Brother, a collection of his prison letters that rocketed him to fame when it was published in November 1970. A dozen of those letters were written in 1969 to Jonathan, by then my classmate in AP English and U.S. History, and a strong student in a tough chemistry class taught by one of our school's few Black teachers, Lee Brown. The summer before our senior year and Denise's coronation, Jonathan traveled north to visit his brother with a plan to gain his release. On August 7, 1970, Jonathan carried a sack of weapons and a rifle concealed beneath his trench coat into the Marin County Courthouse in San Rafael, one of several Frank Lloyd Wright-designed buildings in the futuristic Marin County Civic Center complex. On trial inside was James McLean, a Black San Quentin inmate accused of stabbing a white prison guard. McLean's was one of several cases pending against black radicals in California state penitentiaries, including that of Jonathan's brother, George, accused, along with 2 other inmates of Soledad State Prison, the Soledad brothers we heard about on the evening news, of killing a white guard. If convicted, George faced execution by the state. Pulling a carbine from his bag and shouting, "Okay, this is it, everyone freeze," Jonathan took charge of the courtroom, arming McLean and 2 other San Quentin inmates on hand to testify. The quartet took hostages, the judge, 3 jurors, and an assistant DA. Jonathan demanded the immediate release of his brother and his Soledad comrades in exchange for the hostages' lives. In the ensuing melee, the judge and 2 of the San Quentin prisoners were killed. The assistant DA was paralyzed. 17-year-old Jonathan was dead, too, sprayed with bullets in the front seat of the rented van he'd planned to drive to a nearby airport where he'd meet George and his ardent supporter, Angela Davis, in whose name 2 of the weapons were registered, and hijack a plane to freedom in Algeria, where the Black Panther leader, Eldridge Cleaver, was in exile. So the essay goes on to trace what I could find of Jonathan's childhood and growing up in Pasadena, and recollections of my classmates, and also a history of that volatile time in Pasadena, which was the first city outside of the South to have a desegregation suit in the courts about the schools after the Brown decision, and the busing there took place before the contested busing here in Boston. And I talked too about the year after Jonathan's death, when our school tried to suppress his memory, as if he still was too dangerous for us to even recall. And this is something that many of us resisted in different ways through that year. And by the end of my last year in school, I was a grade grubber. I got to give a talk at the salutatorian, at the baccalaureate ceremonies. And I'm just going to read a little passage about that, because along with John's contributions to the underground newspaper, the yearbook, news clippings, all sorts of things I had saved, I also, as it turned out, saved a copy of the speech that I wrote. The assigned topic was true peace through understanding, but I wasn't having it. The school yearbook had just come out, and as I paged through the senior portraits, I discovered that although another classmate who'd suffered a brain aneurysm and died during junior year was pictured with a black border around his photo, John had been left out. His erasure from our school lives was now complete. I drafted a speech urging my fellow graduating seniors to live our lives with the personal courage and conviction and commitment to ourselves of a Jonathan Jackson, and I turned it in for approval. No, I could not give that speech. I refused to rewrite. My speech was canceled. The day arrived, and I went along to the ceremony anyway, speech folded into the program I was handed at the door, boyfriend at my side. We hadn't donned our caps and gowns, hoping to blend in with the audience, and we took seats among the assembled families in the front row of the bleachers. My name was still listed in the program, and when the time came, I crossed the gym floor to the microphone. Alerted to my banishment, the steely Dr. Wicks, Pasadena's assistant superintendent of schools, rose to meet me, put her arm around my shoulders, and pulled. My boyfriend's pal, our class president, sprang from the speaker's circle and took hold from the other side, steadying me. I began to speak. We are living in an age where anxiety, fear, and frustration are becoming epidemic. As we watch the destruction of our lands and waters by a superabundance of pollutants, we feel anxiety. As we watch the tragic waste of our human resources through feudal wars, through racism, and through our own public system of miseducation, we feel hopelessness and frustration. There seems to be no definite road to take and no base from which to move. Dr. Wicks had returned to her seat, scowling. I had a recommendation. We need to become individuals who can think and feel and act from the very center of our existence. Was Jonathan Jackson such a person? I wanted to think so. I spoke his name. I wasn't alone in honoring John that June. I look back now through our yearbook and find that the Black Students Union, newly formed, had been founded in memory of Jonathan Jackson and Cecil Jones, the other boy who died. They live on. John's name had made it into the yearbook after all. And my copy of the last issue of the Pagan Rights, that was one of the underground papers, distributed across the street from campus. The last issue of the Pagan Rights reminds me that Denise Houlamard, homecoming queen, class secretary, student senator, member of the 1960 Pasadena Central Library Story Hour group, had accepted her school service award in her childhood friend's name, also breaching the silence. John should have been there. We missed him. We always would. Thank you. So, I hadn't read that passage out loud to anyone, but John urged me to do it, and I'm glad that I did.
And you did it beautifully, and it's a very powerful passage. It's a very powerful passage. Can I ask you questions to go back to the beginning of the
Yes.
book? And so one, I should say, and I would like you to develop or elaborate later, I have loved the structure of the book. I mean, the structure is, in a sense, historical. It's each chapter evolves over time, and the first chapter focuses on Hawthorne and particularly Una. When you note that Una resembled Pearl in the Scarlet Letter, and you quote Hawthorne by saying, "There is something that almost frightens me about the child. I know not whether elfish or angelic, but at all events supernatural." And then you write, "Was Una entering his novel, or was Nathaniel seeing Una as the character he'd imagined into being? The love child who could not be kept from asking unwelcome questions or speaking truths she intuited from the adults around her." Could you elaborate a little bit more on Una, and you also, how you end Una? So she dies. It's unclear how she dies, and as a writer and as a historian, you have, I think, a beautiful framework for understanding or trying to understand Una, which is, in a sense, it's ambivalent. You don't take a specific stand.
Thank you. You know, as you bring this up after my thinking about my own childhood and growing up in Pasadena, and my interest in the childhoods of the subjects I write about, it's really a kind of passion for me. And I wanted to add, I guess, just before we moved to the Hawthornes, that my grandmother, who was this children's librarian and told wonderful stories, which I later found out she had memorized from books. They didn't just spew out of her mouth, but I became persuaded that she was the librarian who had introduced Octavia Butler to the library in Pasadena and turned her on to reading and to becoming a writer. And I think that the time I spent with my grandmother in the library shelving books in the children's room helped me get there too. So I think it's not surprising that I ended up taking this interest in Una Hawthorne, the oldest of the three children of Sophia Peabody and Nathaniel Hawthorne. One of the other meanings of afterlives, I mean, there's afterlives after the books, there's giving an afterlife to people like Jonathan or my grandparents, who are less known, but then there's the way that one's subjects haunt you and have an afterlife in your work. And this is what drew me to writing about Una Hawthorne, who had her early death at age 33 had always puzzled me. And as those of you who have read the Peabody Sisters know, I ended the book kind of halfway through their lives. It makes a complete book, I think, the Peabody Sisters. But Sophia had only just married Nathaniel Hawthorne at the end of the book, and I never got around to really treating this mystery of her. Sophia and Una both died in England in the 1870s. Nathaniel died in 1864, around age 60, when the family was in Concord. But Sophia took the children to Europe, thinking that they might be able to eke out a better living in Europe on the royalties from Nathaniel's work and also some of Sophia's own journals that she'd published. So she died. Sophia had always been a bit unwell, and she died in her 60s in 1871. And then Una, at 33, in 1877, also in England, they were buried in Kensal Green Cemetery in London. And this is I'm going to get to each of your questions. The year after the Peabody Sisters were published, their remains were exhumed and moved to Sleepy Hollow Cemetery, and I was invited to be part of this ceremony. And in a private occasion, I was present with one of the Hawthorne descendants, Allison Deming, a poet and essayist, and we were left alone with the small casket in which the remains were held, and told that we could open the lid if we wanted. Allison decided to open the lid. I wasn't going to be the one to make the decision, but what I found there, again, gave me some more clues to this mysterious death of Una. I don't think I should say what I saw, though, because they're not going to buy the book if I say what I saw. So, all right, I'm not going to say what I saw. However, it did send me back to this question, and that gave me the opportunity really to explore a life that was promising, but also, eclipsed by the fame. I mean, I think this is one of the first families of a famous writer to exist around the same time as the Emerson children. They were friends in Concord, but Nathaniel Hawthorne and Sophia were very different people from the very public Emersons, and in some ways, I guess you'd have to say more conventional Emersons, and that was one of the points of comparison. What was going on with the Emerson daughters compared to the Hawthorne daughters, who were left actually orphaned in their early 20s. Whereas poor, I forget now, it's Ellen Emerson, who ended up taking care of her father through, she devoted her life to his care, but it gave her a purpose in life, which I think Una never had. So, this was a process of ferreting out from what I could find, and then the question, yes, about about Una as a potential little pearl. It was something that even people within her own family remarked on. Her aunt Elizabeth, Nathaniel's sister, said, this child, little pearl, is unlike anyone except our Una. And Nathaniel has these wonderful journals that he drew on to write his novels, and his descriptions of Una are very like those of Pearl. And I had to wonder, as I said, I'm interested in childhood and what we make of childhood, and I think Nathaniel's very good at evoking children, but I think he was also kind of mystified by this spirit. It was his first child. What do you do? They are. I mean, we all have this. Anyone who's had children or who has been a child, children are people, and he was learning this through Una and putting, really a character who's, I think, as memorable as Hester Prynne in that novel.
You have a beautiful line when you say, I would not assist in turning Una Hawthorne into a fiction.
Right. That it kept happening over and over again as she had a series of breakdowns, and people who knew about that would say, oh, no wonder anybody who had a father like that would, of course, or she's like a character in his novels. And it kept coming up, and I was trying very hard to see something other than that. And of course, she was trying to live a life other than that as well, even as she knew that this was the source of her, well-being, that her father's fiction succeed, that she continued to further his fiction in one way or another. People after his death coming around to, could I look at his papers? Oh, of course. Thomas Wentworth Higginson, who wrote about her in one of his passages about her Titianesque beauty. One of the amazing things I discovered was there's a glorious portrait of her in the Concord Library, and they didn't used to feature it much, but it was in a kind of stairwell on the way to the special collections where I would do research. Beautiful red hair and kind of this pallor. I think it was actually done in pastels. But in researching this, I began looking into, who were the painters. There were two people listed as, or the artists who made this portrait. And sure enough, I found out these were people that before Una's mother died, she'd been warning her against. Don't spend time with those, as it turns out, pre-Raphaelites, bohemian types in the Kensington part of London. And sure enough, after her mother's death, she did begin hanging out with these people, and one of them had a wonderful recollection, which I quote in the essay, which I'm also not going to tell you, but all of it is to say that this pre-Raphaelite picture, I suddenly could tell you a whole lot about that I didn't know before, and this is just, the pleasure of this kind of work.
Yes. You mentioned, and I won't give much away, but you say that this was in terms of Una Hawthorne. You said I would not assist in turning her into a fiction, and that was the lesson of looking inside the coffin.
Yes. Right. I'll just finish that little line. Did you?
It's page 32.
32.
I can finish it. I have it right.
Oh, well.
So inside, there was the lesson of looking. That was the lesson of looking inside the coffin. There are a few things that we can know for sure: a patch of cloth, a fragment of bone, a red braid, and then there are the questions we cannot answer. I think that...
I still haven't given away the secret, though.
No, you haven't.
Still have to buy the book.
That's right. What I love about that passage is that as a writer, you recognize, and especially as a in this case a nonfiction writer, you cannot take too many leaps. That exploring a question, exploring a life, there are unknowns that you can never fully recover, and to try to ram home an argument that isn't supported by the evidence is a falsification both of the past and a falsification of, in one sense, being a writer.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I think that brings to mind how powerful the things we have are.
Yes.
Yes. And maybe we could talk a little bit about the essay about things, or
Yes,
what's your plan?
yes.
Do we
No,
have? Do we don't know? Should we jump to that?
Yes, that's. So yes, there's a chapter on things, useless things.
Yeah,
objects.
These useless things.
And you refer to Jules Prown, who is a art historian. He's retired now, but he was a very well-known art historian at Yale, and he had a very intricate, detailed method for exploring and analyzing and describing things, whether it's works of art or objects. As you point out, that the language of form is like a language of words, which, would you like to elaborate on
well,
that?
this essay, These Useless Things, which I'll just give a shout out to my friend Judith Tick, who's been writing a biography of Ella Fitzgerald all the time I was working on this. So These Foolish Things, These Useless Things, it's a title meant in fun in my case, but through pretty much all of my writing life as a biographer, I was so focused on the words, on the journals, the letters that I could find, and I was writing about people who left extensive, records in documents of that nature, and I was so happy to just, immerse myself in their, the way they expressed themselves. Elizabeth Bishop, maybe most of all, because she was really such a fine writer herself. But I realized as I kind of emerged from this, this had been going on for some time. There was increasingly a practice of writing histories from things, as Susan Ware has done with writing about the suffrage movement in a book called Why They Marched, using objects were there 19 objects for the 19th Amendment, and 19 women that she wrote about. So it was going on there, on the edges of my awareness, and I began thinking about the importance of things in my life and the tactileness and the way memory and identity is embedded in these things. And I started this essay writing about the ice pick that I happen to still have that had belonged to my father. And why did I save this ice pick, which was probably from the 30s. And, it's you can find them on eBay, things that everybody used to have blocks of ice in their ice boxes. And there were ice companies that would go around delivering them, and they would just hand out these ice picks as kind of a advertising gimmick. So you had the phone number of the ice company on it, and its motto, and its address, and the Arctic Ice Company. And my dad had, as I guess one did, he had a wine cork on the end of it. So it wasn't like this very dangerous thing, but it was sitting on my windowsill and kind of reminding me of him and his good days when he was wielding the ice pick to make ice cream for us and breaking up a block of ice. This essay then kind of travels through a number of, some of the essays are very chronological. The one about Jonathan Jackson or my grandparents in World War I, they kind of follow a narrative, but this is more associative. And it ends with something that I wanted to document, that is somewhat documented in Peter's exhibit out there. It ends with my acquiring the Peabody Sisters writing desk, which I had written about in my book, and discovered much about it in papers here at the MHS, a journal of Elizabeth Peabody's that was transcribed by a disciple of hers. The original is lost, but this desk is now in my office, sitting on top of a shelf above my own computer. But someone who had read my book some years later, he said, reading over the shoulder of his wife, he wouldn't himself have read the Peabody Sisters, but he said, I think I have this desk, and he initially wanted me to help him find a buyer for it, or a library that would buy it from him, but he couldn't really document how it had come to him, and at the time, nobody was interested, so I bought it from him. But I'll just, it was a Honduran, I learned from a furniture conservator, a Honduran mahogany portable writing desk, a campaign furniture. Are you familiar with that? Probably that had become popular. It was used by the military, but this was 1826. That this was given to them, and Elizabeth, by their students. So they were in their early 20s and had a school in Brookline, just over here. And Elizabeth and her sister were teaching things that were too radical for the community there, and they were booted out. But the students liked them, and they gave them this writing desk. I'm writing on a writing desk, which was presented to Mary and me by our scholars, Elizabeth says. It's one of the handsomest I ever saw. Everything convenient for writing: paper, wafers, inkstand, sand stand, a pen knife which cost $1, an ivory knife to cut paper with, a silver pencil case with pencil in it. All of this I had put in my book without really thinking what those things were, or what the object was. I was amazed at how small it was, and this comes from the journal. This was accompanied by a note, very affectionate, which I shall bring home to show you in the letter. Then in the journal she says, "How delightful it is, this overflowing heart of the young. How blessed is the employment which brings one in such close contact with it." This is Elizabeth Peabody, who became the founder of the kindergartens in America much later. But I want to just read a little passage from this essay, which gives you a very different sense a sense of the range of the kind of writing that is going on in these essays, where I just really kind of got going on the things from my childhood that I later turned away from in order to read, but I think it's something that happens. Well, this whole business of writing retrospectively and writing autobiographically after a life and writing about other people. I've noticed that, Annette Gordon-Reed has her Juneteenth, and David Levering Lewis, The Stained Glass Window, has just come out, his recollections. I mention them because we all three were presidents of the Society of American Historians at one point. So here we are thinking back, but here's thinking back to things. I don't remember living through the developmental stage at which young children explore the world by putting things in their mouths. But it must have been soon after that I discovered the joy of sorting, piling up, forming patterns on the carpet with the objects no longer useful or just waiting to be used that my parents offered me for play. There was the plain cedar button box with its exposed corner joinery I still have and open now after years stowed on a bookshelf next to my mother's college texts to see what's inside. On top, a cluster of yellowing cards bearing sets of 3, 6, 8 buttons of varied sizes and colors from La Mode, choice of smart women for more than 90 years. Le Chic, Jewel Tone, Pacific, Truecraft, marked with prices ranging from 10 to 59 cents. Underneath, a rainbow of discs, the small C I remember sliding my hands into. I find tiny mother-of-pearl stars and fish, faux brass buttons with eagles and anchors, woven leather buttons that remind me of the hooded camel hair car coat I had in 7th grade and rarely took off, my shelter from high-stress social life in junior high. Sunk to the bottom, a scattering of what appear to be brown and black coffee beans affixed to metal hooks, shoe buttons from a distant age. A crumpled plastic baggie surfaces with the intricate turquoise knots and looped fasteners of the faded Chinese housecoat my mother wore all the years of my childhood as her art-making smock. She is she made this is her self-portrait, so part of the book is about her career as an artist, and I'm glad she's on my cover. Why had she saved them when the fabric gave out? Because she had a button box, which became mine after her death 3 decades in the past. What I no longer possess is more vivid still, the cardboard box of ceramic tile samples in muted earth tones, cool to the touch, that I laid out as doll-sized walkways or floors of imaginary rooms on the gray living room rug. The Japanese box, whose inlaid rustic scenery split into 2 and then 4 cantilevered compartments, opening out to reveal bumpy beads of confetti-colored Murano glass and pale carved bone, smooth lozenges of amber, gleaming pink crystal globes with miniature explosions inside, my grandmother's broken jewelry. I never thought of the kitchens or bathrooms the tiles might have lined, the necklaces from which the beads had come unstrung, These useless things had no past or future. They were simply mine to handle and admire, in a way to love. Things.
That's beautiful. Thank you.
So how are we doing? We have some more time for questions
Okay.
from you or, you know.
Are there questions from the audience?
Yeah. Oh, thank you. Oops, we'll get it on.
I think I can project.
But I think they need it for the online people.
Go ahead.
Go, okay.
I loved what you read in this new personal tone to the book, and I'm fascinated by the fact that that is your mother's artwork on the cover.
Yes.
And I'm wondering, was that your idea, or could you talk a little about her and her being an artist and how that might have affected you becoming an artist?
Yes. Thank you. Well, one of the last essay in the book is called Left-Handed, and it derives from the fact that my both grandmothers and my mother and my aunt that I saw the most of were all left-handed, and as a child I sort of thought I would, you know, all adult women are left-handed, so of course I would grow up to be left-handed, which I didn't, and none of the children of our generation did. But my mother, who, you know, I initially thought this was kind of a woman's superpower, but I also began to see that my mother in particular, well, one grandmother had her arm tied to her chest in school so she wouldn't write with it, and my mother felt sort of clumsy, even as she was this very talented artist. And this all kind of became wrapped up with my sense of women's lives and my motivation to write about women's lives. There's a way in which being a woman is a handicap, like the, you know, sort of arbitrarily, the arbitrary handicap of being left-handed. And this portrait, you can see on the cover, she has this, I don't really know when she painted it. It was found by my sister around the time I was working on this in a portfolio of things. You can see that she's writing with her right hand. And it's not simply that she was, you know, drawing herself in a mirror, because she has her hair parted on the correct side. So I speculated about that, and you know what? Well, I would say certainly my mother's and really both my parents' great respect for creative people and their yearning to be them and actually being them in my mother's case. Definitely affected my sense of what was possible to do in the world, even as I saw it as kind of a cautionary tale that my mother was not able to realize her talents. And I worried, you know, certainly all those years of working on the Peabody Sisters and never finishing it, would this be my fate as well? I did finish it, though, you know. But 20 years is a long time to be doubting yourself. So, yes, I think I'm really thrilled to have her on the cover, because she actually didn't live to read any of my biographies. She didn't survive till the completion of the Peabody Sisters, so that's very meaningful to me as well. But I think this has a lot to do with the kind of lives that have interested me. I mean, it's true for all women that you're dealing with a pressure to compromise and a conflicts. All people, but women more than men, I would say. The domestic life exerts its powers, and the expectations that you would bow to those demands. And seeing how all the women that I've written about respond to that, all of them very different, that's been really a fascination of mine. And I think, that's part of the opening of actually the book, the Afterlives essays, you know, dead men tell no tales,
Right.
but dead women do,
That's
at
right.
least
It's a
to
great
me.
quote.
I said, and yeah.
Yeah,
they-
I included that. Dead
Yeah.
men tell no tales, but dead women do. They speak in questions. Which is such a beautiful line.
Yeah, I didn't mean to cut off your questions. I see you have some more
So
notes here.
the one that I've mentioned this to you. I think that your book is just beautifully structured, and you had referred to essays, but I don't see this as a collection of essays. I see it as a coherent narrative nonfiction that's in a rich tradition, in a sense, that a lot of people have not appreciated. So something like Hemingway's In Our Time, it happens to be fiction, but each chapter is discrete, and yet the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. Or Willa Cather's Professor House, where the Tom Outland story gets plucked into the center. And Cather actually published it as a separate short story first, and the novel coheres, I think, brilliantly. Probably the best example is Du Bois's Souls of Black Folk. Each chapter focuses on a different theme related to race, and especially in the late 19th, early 20th century, or Dos Passos' USA trilogy, where there's a biographical section. There's like 4 different parts, but each book of the trilogy, there's a coherence, a beautiful coherence. And I'd love to know, one, whether that was something you conceptualized at the beginning. Is it something that you came to as you were writing? Did you explicitly want it to be a narrative nonfiction book rather than a collection of essays? How did I think the power of the narrative is extraordinary, and was that something that came to you, or was it something that you intended upon from the beginning?
Well, thank you very much for that praise and for describing the book in that way. I wrote 3 of the essays, never thinking of collecting them necessarily, kind of waiting for the next biography to fall in my lap. And those were the one about my grandparents in the war, the one that we haven't spoken of, about a period I spent in Kyoto, and the pandemic, and then the recollection of Jonathan Jackson. And then I kind of thought, well, maybe I could do more like this. And I proposed a collection of essays. I thought, well, they're short story collections. This could be they could be each. In fact, I thought of them each as quite different, which in a way they are. But when my editor said, well, I proposed a few others that I might write, and she said, well, we don't want a memoir. We want to hear you writing about the craft of biography. So then I put my mind to writing the Una Hawthorne essay, which is a lot about how biography stays with us. But the other ones, I kept trying to write the ones about the craft of biography, and they became quite personal. I wanted to write about material culture history and how that's used in biography, but I started writing about the ice pick and the button box, and the what else? The left-handed, So I turned them in, and my editor said, "Well, yeah, this is kind of a memoir, and I like it,
That's great.
And then I wrote a beginning and an ending, and we made sure that the it did run kind of chronologically, and that nothing, information wasn't repeated from one to the next. And I began to realize that the word afterlife or after lives, sometimes as 2 words, kept showing up in the essays as well, often in the language of other people. My grandfather said when he, at the end, after the armistice, which he had managed to barge into the Chamber of Deputies to hear Clemenceau read out the articles of the armistice, and a very moving scene that he put in his letters, he decided to stay to take a job with the International Red Cross, which had just been founded then, and he said, we are in the greatest position to have an afterlife, in after the war. So he had used that, but I'm very glad to hear that it reads as a book, and I do sometimes think of these as chapters, not essays. I think maybe that is a better way to think of them. And, I think some people are kind of scared off by biographies, and some people are scared off by essays, and so, I don't know, this is just a book.
You bring them together.
But I think, I started off with, I was very taken by a prologue to a book of short biographical sketches by Gamaliel Bradford from the early 20th century, and his prologue is called Confessions of a Biographer, and he says we're all biographers from childhood, and that we're always comparing our lives to the lives of others around us, and I think that's very true of me, and I, as I say in my own prologue, that then the child who goes on to become a biographer is a whole different kind of experience, but that I think it's something that is innate to us, or should be innate to us. Right. It's innate to us unless it's beaten out of us, that the curiosity of others. And I was remembering the other day, it's not in this book, but it's in the Peabody Sisters, Elizabeth Peabody's theory of the social principle. This was her transcendentalism. It began with the relationship of the mother and the child. You learn to love and care for the other, and then this extends to the family and to the town and to the country beyond this. The social principle, she thought, was what drives people. Right. And maybe the social principle is what drives biographers.
Yeah, that's great. Questions?
Thank you for being here. I'm appreciating this a lot. You referenced that there's a sort of insecurity with a long project such as the Peabody Sisters. That there's extensive research and years of writing, and you're never sure, how it's going to go or be received. On the flip side, there's the personal narrative, which seems like it could have a lot of insecurity as well, which is like, who cares about a button box, or
exactly.
You know what I mean? And so I'm wondering, did you find the personal narrative easier, more interesting? What was different about the two experiences, and maybe I don't understand exactly why you switched.
That's a very good question. I began going down this slippery slope with my biography of Elizabeth Bishop, who had been my professor at Harvard, and I really felt I couldn't write about her without being upfront about my connection with her, which was not entirely positive. So I decided to try something which I had actually learned from my friend Diane McWhorter's wonderful book, Carry Me Home, about the Birmingham, Alabama in 1963 and the Civil Rights Revolution, as she calls it. And she had grown up through this time, and it's a wonderful chronicle, very well researched, and won a Pulitzer in nonfiction. But every long chapter is you get a little bit of relief hearing her own life story growing up through this time, and her own, perhaps her father's connection to the wrong side in that revolution. So I decided I would try that, and what I found was, so I have, the book is structured as, I think there's 6 biographical chapters, and then they're interspersed by memoir passages that trace my experience as a young would-be poet at Harvard and my interactions with Bishop. And I found, kind of to my surprise, that those were incredibly easy to write, the memoir sections, because I was writing down, I think, stories that I'd told myself, and I didn't have to research them very much. I mean, I did look up my transcripts, and I interviewed people who were in the class, and I did research them to a certain extent. But I teach at Emerson in the MFA Creative Writing program. I teach nonfiction writing, and most of my students are writing memoirs, and I had less sympathy with them after that for the struggles that they claim to have in getting the words on the page. But I realized also, as I just said, I was thinking back on things that had sort of taken the form of stories already. And I think, many people who write, even if they're biographers or literary critics, are writing because they want to be heard. There was something happened in childhood that they were not heard, and they want to be heard. And whether it's through writing my biography of the Peabody Sisters, I think I was gradually getting towards these stories that I wanted to tell, somehow had to tell, and did tell in afterlives. And now I've told them. I'll probably go back to writing about other people, I think. But I think I needed to do that. And it's all of these chapters consist of a fair amount of research. So it wasn't as easy as writing the little memoir sections in the Bishop book. But it was a very different kind of feeling. And I will say, though, that the question you began with, how do you know people are going to be interested or even care about your button box? Well, people did seem to resonate with the autobiographical sections in the Bishop book.
You make them care.
Yeah,
through your
I guess,
writing.
I was going to say, somebody once said to me, I was speaking to someone, a professor, I won't name him, but I said I'd written this collection of essays that were mostly autobiographical, and he said, well, it's one thing to write them, but is anyone going to want to read them? And I thought, I was kind of offended and hurt. But once the book was out, he said the same thing to me, and then he explained that he had written his memoir, not necessarily to be published, but really just for his grandchildren, and they weren't even reading it. So, so I didn't feel insulted anymore. I thought he was, showing compassion, I guess, or he meant to. But, I guess all the years of practicing writing have helped me learn, and the work with my students, and the reading that I did in order to be a good teacher of personal narrative to my students helped me learn how to do this. And I was also, during the pandemic, having a regular phone call with two friends, one of whom is a poet and an essayist, Grace Schulman. We just had these calls, and she would read the poems she had written, and I started reading the Kyoto essay, and the fact that they were listening and wanted to hear more kept me writing.
That's great. There was another hand up, I think. Let's go ahead.
Hi there. My question is a little bit similar, but I'm interested in the difference between writing about early 19th century and writing your own life, and the scrupulousness of the historian that one applies when you're using manuscripts and whatever sources you can lay your hands on that's incomplete with early historical work. Do you feel that your work in 20th century things in your own life, you feel that you've given the same sort of, do I remember this right? Is this true? The same sort of scrupulous historicism that you would give to the earlier material? Do you find that you examine your own history that way?
I talked about the things and the letters and journals. I was very lucky in that my mother or my grandparents saved their letters and my mother saved the letters, and that they all landed with me because I, for a while, had a large house in Newton, and I was known to be interested in letters and journals. So I had all these things, which I've since donated to various archives, Schlesinger and Harvard University archives. So I did a lot of the research for this book in the archive, reading my own family papers there. At a point when I had to downsize, I was lucky to be able to find places for these things because I was worried about their safety and longevity. So I had more the experience of finding confirmation of family stories, or deeper. Well, I guess that wasn't so much the case with my grandparents in World War I. That was a real exploration and discovery of what was happening for them. So, but I was finding it in their letters. I also had the eerie experience of that sort of dark tales that I had that were rumored were suddenly pinned down in a letter. You know, my mother's mother saying in a letter to my mother's parents also married very quickly during World War I, but they weren't able to stay together. So her husband was heading off on a sub chaser to Europe in 1918. And right after the wedding. And so she's writing to him, and she hadn't really known him for very long. She said, "Did I ever tell you that when I was born, my father wouldn't look at me for days?" And it was because she was the second daughter, and he wanted to have sons, and he just moved out. That was it, you know. And I'd known there was a divorce, and I'd known that she very much favored her firstborn. My grandmother favored her firstborn child, who was a son. But this letter went on to say, I hope that we have sons, because women who don't have sons, their husbands leave them. And, you know, this was like ground zero of my family that I had hit upon in this letter that, you know, was a series of love letters that were wonderful evidence from the war, but there was this family history. Suddenly she's telling him, I mean, if they hadn't been separated, she would have spoken those words and I wouldn't have had them. So there were other things like that. And my mother, I said, her mother favored her firstborn son, and then one other child, a daughter, and her mother didn't walk away from her, but they weren't close. But they still wrote letters every week, back and forth, and, you know, for decades and decades. And those letters were just full of detail in my mother's work, and I was trying to put together her art career. I learned about a fellowship she applied for, and I learned about her trying to get a raise when she worked they lived in Cambridge for a while, for the city planning board, and that they said, you know, we can't give a raise to a married woman, even though she was supporting my dad, who was a graduate student. And anyway, that sort of thing. It was there. I was lucky, and I guess I have to say I still come down on the side of letters and journals. If you got them, then you have a story.
Other questions?
Any questions from the virtual folk? No.
I have one last question.
Mm-hmm.
Also, I found just wonderful. From Walden to John Updike.
Oh, yes. Well, Walden to John Updike.
Yes.
Right. Well, you know, as I was writing these, I was having conversations with my poet friend on the phone and my Bennington classmate, Emily. But I also, during the pandemic, actually just before the pandemic, I established with another friend, Jeff Mayerson, the owner of Harvard Bookstore, we have a book group, and we read books and discuss them, and he had never read the Rabbit novels. I mean, these are books that, initially this was books that we were ashamed that we hadn't read, and we were not going to tell anyone what they were, and now I just blew his cover. So anyway, but I happened to be reading the Rabbit novels around the time I was writing These Useless Things, and I just noticed that a motif in all of these novels is the defunct ice plant, which is already defunct in the 50s, late 50s, but, you know, there's still like the stain of mossy stuff, and he remembers falling in the, you know, and then he remembers the block of ice and associates it with a young woman who's visited him in his high school years, something like that. Anyway, so the ice pick enabled me. I mean, I know that there's a lot of important documents about the ice trade in the Mass Historical Society. I did not write about that fellow. I've forgotten his name now. Yeah, everybody knows. I didn't write about him, but I did write about also the part of Walden in which Thoreau was talking about. The ice trade took over Walden Pond, and he's observing these. I think they were mostly Irish laborers who were kind of enslaved, he sees, to this overlord who's got them harvesting the ice and piling them up. And he says, oh, the waters of of Walden are going to be mixing with those of the Ganges, because he realizes they put these blocks of ice on under sawdust, and they're sent over to India, where they're cooling the drinks of the British, I guess, masters. Anyway, so that. Again, I'm not going to tell you all of what's in that chapter, but there was a lot in that chapter: the ice pick, the buttons, the Walden, the Updike, the desk.
Yes.
I don't know. It's all there.
Fits beautifully
Yes.
into the chapter.
I'll have to say, somebody asked me, had I ever thought of writing wanted to write about a biography of a male figure, and I had at one point wanted to write about Updike, because I think he's kind of a domestic novelist, and does care about the home front, but in what way, I don't know, and somebody else has done it. So, thank you so much. One last question, maybe, or two last questions. Okay.
I
Just
wondered
over
if you
there.
wanted to update us a little, only if you're comfortable, about what you're thinking about writing next, because I was intrigued by your afterword or final epilogue on the woman artist Lauren McIver and Skylight and her relationships with early 20th century male abstract artists. And I was just thinking I've always been fascinated by Diebenkorn's Ocean Park series. So windows sort of on the edge of abstraction.
I haven't talked to my editor or agent about this, but I do have thoughts of two different collections of chapters, not essays. One might be, I'll just tell you, could be called Past Lives, about people buried in Mount Auburn Cemetery, where I spend a lot of time walking, and there are very interesting people there, as everybody knows. And I also would maybe write a collection called Lost Lives, about people that I might have written a biography of, but did not. And one of those people is Helen Frankenthaler, who I was quite serious of thinking of writing about at one point, and it would include why I didn't. So I'm not going to spoil that for you either, but thank you for asking. But I do think that I may have said enough about my own life at this point. One more.
There was another hand up.
I'm wondering if you could speak to how you chose your topics and your process for editing your personal narrative.
Well, how did I choose my topics? Well, let's see. There's partly the journalist in me. I knew that I thought that if I wrote about the armistice at the Centennial, I could get that published, and that did show up in the New Yorker online. And I also had that thought about Jonathan Jackson's anniversary, that maybe I could, get interest someplace in that. But most of the essays were more, just where my interest wandered, and to some extent my editor said, yes, I'm interested in that too. So there were a couple of things that we just didn't pursue, and now I don't even remember what they were. And then I would do a lot of reading on them. As John said, I read it, he mentioned Jules Prown, but I read a lot of, and it's all in the sources, all the reading I did about objects and material culture history and that kind of thing. So, and then they would just sort of percolate, and usually a sentence would come in my mind as I was walking at Mount Auburn or some other place, and that would be the beginning, and I just would kind of follow it. Since my first book, The Peabody Sisters, was one that I kind of wrote like 450 pages, and they weren't really right, and I just had to throw them out, and then I had a vision of how to structure it, and I was able to write and just write consecutively. So I tend to write in a way that I don't necessarily recommend it, but it is the way I write, that I edit as I go along. And so it's not, rarely am I going back and reorganizing things. It's more you know, I can't go forward until it's right. Well, thank you, John, and thank you everyone for being here.